Good morning, the world. Welcome to the Wellington School of Business and Government's webinar series on tourism and what it will look like in a post-COVID-19 world. Today, we're going to focus on destination recovery strategies, and we have 3 speakers from across the globe. Without doubt, COVID-19 has had the biggest impact in modern times on tourism, and there is without doubt no destination in the world that hasn't been affected. Every sector, every product, every country, every region, every city, every tourist in some sort of format has been affected. And so the key question is, how have these destinations responded? Can we learn from each other? And what will the future look like in a post-COVID-19 world? Today, we have 3 speakers from Scotland, New York, and New Zealand. The 3 speakers are Stephen England Hall, the Chief Executive of Tourism New Zealand, who to many of you will not need an introduction. He is the leader of New Zealand's domestic and international tourism destination management company. We have Riddell Graham, who's the Director of Strategy and Partnerships for VisitScotland, the destination management company of Scotland. And we have Donna Keren, who is the Executive Vice President of the New York City and Company Destination Management Company. And each of these 3 speakers from across the globe will tell us their story, what the impact of COVID-19 has been, how they've responded, and what they think the future will look like. So I welcome our 3 speakers to this webinar. And first of all, I'd like to hand over to Stephen England Hall, Chief Executive of Tourism New Zealand, who will talk about New Zealand's response to this. Okay, so I'm going to switch off the slides and then bring them back. So Stephen will have the screen.
Great. Good morning. Thank you, Ian, and thank you to all attendees for joining us today for this discussion. I'm not going to make a particular slide presentation. I thought I would just speak through the journey that we've been on here in New Zealand, and then leave as much time as possible for a bit of Q&A unfolding on the back of my colleagues here presentations as well. I think so. There's probably a couple of things about a couple of context points for New Zealand. The first is Tourism New Zealand, up until COVID-19 occurred, was focused entirely on international markets, and we didn't actually have a role in domestic marketing or on the domestic side of tourism at all in New Zealand. But once COVID-19 hit New Zealand, our borders closed, and of course the country effectively went into lockdown, bringing what was pre-COVID-19 New Zealand's largest export industry at 20% of export receipts, and a significant contributor to GDP here in New Zealand, around 8%, and roughly around the same number of employment. That whole industry, of course, just stopped. We actually hit a point during the period in April where we had 0 arrivals and 0 departures to New Zealand for the first time since I think 1840 or something like that. So it was a very unusual situation. And of course, with the country in lockdown initially, of course now we're out of lockdown. We're in a much more open environment here in New Zealand, and that's enabled domestic tourism at least to start to recover. From a destination strategy point of view, as a consequence of the impact on the tourism sector, and of course the economic flow-on impacts to New Zealand of the sector grinding to a halt, the government made a decision in collaboration with our board that Tourism New Zealand would lead the initial restart of the tourism economy, so that and focus entirely on the domestic space initially, and then of course work across our international markets to keep New Zealand's brand alive internationally, with a view to enabling us to accelerate international tourism when the time comes, when it's safe to do so and the borders can be reopened. So with that kind of shift in our mandate, you could imagine, we had to mobilize our team pretty quickly to change tack entirely and establish a new destination marketing team with a focus on the domestic marketplace, as I mentioned before, for the first time in a very long time. And in fact, we've been up and running fully now for about 6 weeks on the domestic side of things. And that program is actually unfolding incredibly well and is actually starting to have some real impacts on how New Zealanders are relating to New Zealand as a destination. It's having impacts on the speed and rate of recovery of the sector here in New Zealand from a domestic point of view. And of course, it's really helping to prime the supply side of the sector for, what will eventually be open, a more open marketplace and an opportunity for us to welcome international guests. So as an organisation right now, we really have 4 core strategies. The first one, of course, is to drive participation and inclusion in the domestic tourism economy. And what that really means is get more New Zealanders out and about enjoying New Zealand as a destination. And in fact, relating to New Zealand like it's a place to go on holiday, which may sound quite funny, but many people don't relate to their own home or to their own country as a destination. They think it's when they travel abroad, often they consider it a destination. So we've actually had quite a bit of work to do, and we think it'll take some time to change the relationship between Kiwis or New Zealanders and New Zealand as a place to actually go on holiday and experience as a visitor. And that's a big shift, not just for Kiwis' mindsets, but also for the New Zealand domestic tourism industry to treat Kiwis as well, like visitors. And there's a real shift there that has to go on. And I think that's actually been quite a bit of fun, to be fair. And we can see that's going to unfold over time and have a really big positive impact for both New Zealanders and, of course, the industry. The second strategy is around the international piece. I mentioned before, whilst the borders are closed, it's imperative that Tourism New Zealand keeps the idea of New Zealand and the idea of the brand of New Zealand, if you like, the destination brand of New Zealand alive in the hearts and minds of consumers around the world for 2 principal reasons. One is going dark or being off the air for any extended period of time will slow down the economic recovery of tourism when the time comes. And the second is there's a direct relationship between our brand awareness and desirability and preference for New Zealand and other exports, such as food, fibre, technology, etc. So keeping the brand alive when people can't actually travel here is incredibly important, and obviously requires real balance, because the last thing we want to do is run global promotional marketing that asks people to do something they can't actually do. So we've had to shift the tone of our international program completely to accommodate that. The third strategy is around providing business support to operators to enable them to best pivot, if you like, or change their business practice or model off of what is now a more sustainable but significantly reduced domestic tourism industry and tourism base. And helping a lot of businesses make those decisions has been really important for the long-term survivability and recovery of the industry. And the fourth part, which is something that you can imagine in a COVID world has become incredibly important, and that's providing evidence-based advice to government and industry leaders. And that last one is really about how we inform decision-making, how we inform policy change, how we inform significant decisions that governments have to make in these difficult times with evidence about the sector, for the sector, and through the lens of the consumer, but also through the lens of the industry. So, I mean, I guess that's probably it in a nutshell. I'll leave it there, Ian, if that's okay. That's given you about 8 minutes worth of content, and hopefully that's sort of give you a bit of a perspective on what's happening in New Zealand, and I look forward to answering any questions that might arise.
Thank you, Stephen. You've raised lots of interesting points there, and we'll come back to at the end of the 3 speakers, and we'll raise many of the points and questions there. Could I remind participants, if you've got a question to ask, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and just type in the question, and we'll either answer your question during the session or towards the end. And there'll be an opportunity for the panelists to respond to those questions as well. Sorry, my screen has frozen in the terms of presentation, so I can't. Try again. Apologies for this technological error. No, my screen has frozen, I'm afraid. I can't. So I just have to try again. So our next speaker is Riddell Graham. It's a pleasure to welcome Riddell to New Zealand here. There's many stories I can tell you about Riddell from my time as the scenario planner at VisitScotland, but this is on Zoom and the world is watching, so I can't go into those details. Riddell Graham is the Director of Industry and Destination Development at VisitScotland and has fundamentally led the destination's response to COVID-19. So without any further ado, welcome, Riddell.
Ian, welcome, and welcome to everyone listening from a rather overcast 9:45 in the evening in Scotland. I could tell you loads of stories about Ian, but yeah, they would be too embarrassing to share. So we just flip into the next slide. This just gives you an idea of the impact. Well, the impact that the virus has had on Scotland. And just for those that don't know the country, population 5.4 million, 18,000 people tested positive, and as of today, almost 2,500 deaths in the country. So a huge health issue, let alone the economic impact. Next slide, Ian. And the importance of tourism to the Scottish economy, worth a lot of money, 10.5 billion. Over 200,000 jobs, 8% of the total workforce. And then just look at that figure at the bottom of the slide there. Our estimate from April to June this year, £1.6 billion lost from tourism alone and lost business to the Scottish economy. Next slide, Ian. Just to put our tourism in some kind of context and interesting, listening to Stephen about his picture of the world from New Zealand. Domestic trips are very important to us, but international spend is significantly more important. So you see that slide there, fewer trips from domestic market, but much higher spend from the international side as well. Next slide, Ian. And this is the phases that our government set in terms of its route map to get out of the virus. I suspect very similar to a number of other countries. Phase 1, where we're just dealing with it, it's not contained. 2, there's some control. 3, it's being suppressed. And then 4, no longer a significant threat. Right now in Scotland, we're sitting between phase 2 and 3, and hopefully announcements tomorrow will ease that up. And there's the 4 elements of the response to that: respond, reset, restart, and recover. We're working through that. None of them are actually following neatly, and we're still dealing with a lot of response right now. Next slide, Ian. So in 2001, we had a huge outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Scotland. And we created an emergency response group, and Ian was pretty much involved in that, in the creation of that. And we reactivated this for COVID-19. So the response group is a mix of private sector and public sector bodies with government. And we kept the initial group was huge and it just didn't work. So we cut that down to 8, and that's been meeting on a weekly basis since the 16th of March to coordinate the work. And it's developed an action plan around those 4 Rs: the immediate response, providing information support to businesses, then moving on to support and planning, encouraging people to restart, then the support and guidance to safe reopening, and then finally the recovery phase, providing direction for the future. Next slide, Ian. And my team are directly involved. I have somewhere in the region of 300 odd staff that are out there engaging with industry and engaging with customers on the ground. And these are some of the things that as an organisation we've been responsible for. Just as Stephen said, gathering research and getting information that can help advise policy. And we've directly engaged on a one-to-one basis with over 3,500 businesses, contacting them with regular communications, doing global research and travel market intelligence, comparing ourselves to what's going on in the rest of the world. Our quality assurance scheme was suspended, saving £1 million. We set up a destination fund supporting 83 destinations and 10,000 businesses throughout the country, and then providing advice to businesses. And one of the big challenges was that as of today, there were 15 different funding sources from UK and Scottish governments, and we were giving advice and support to them to apply. Next slide, Ian. And quite specifically, work that we've been working on in the past couple of weeks, helping the Scottish Government develop its guidance for the tourism and hospitality industry for safe reopening, and supporting that sector guidance for the likes of the visitor attraction sector, the hospitality sector, the outdoor sector, and self-catering, all supporting that overall one. And the wee click on the side there, the Good to Go self-certification online scheme. In Scotland, as of today, we've got nearly 4,000 businesses signed up to that. And that indicates that they've read the criteria and the guidance, and they're good to go. And they're meeting all the requirements that are a key essential part of that. On our main website, consumer-facing website, all our listings are being updated, and the Good to Go symbol is appearing throughout. And our corporate website, which is used by businesses, has been a huge source of information for them as well. And then finally, just announced last week, first meeting, ministerial task force looking at the priorities for recovery. Next slide, Ian. A significant concern within Scotland has been the concern of communities worried about people bringing the virus back into their area. A number of our island communities have had no virus whatsoever. And so we've been working very closely and engaging with them through a Rural Tourism Fund, best practice, and strong regional and local engagement on an ongoing basis. Next slide, Ian. On the next slide. And just finish off with a few slides on our marketing recovery. Again, neatly linked to those, initially those 4 main parts: respond, reset, restart, and recover. Very much like New Zealand in the early response part, not marketing the country, but keeping it front of mind. Dream now, travel later, a big message. And then on the reset side, dream now, travel later, but trying to get people engaged with inspiring content. And then as of next week, when we start to reopen, reconnecting Scots with Scotland, and a very strong message: stay local and engage locally. And then moving out of that towards the international marketing scene as well. Next slide, Ian. Supporting that all the way through, ongoing research on sentiment in the UK market and holiday intentions to Scotland. That has changed, as you would imagine, over the past month or so, and we're keeping that front of mind as we look to hit the right kind of markets from a marketing point of view. Next slide. And some of the creative proposition around escapism, stories, awe-inspiring drama, de-stressing, and the really important one about that sense of belonging, connecting Scots with their country, very much like New Zealand connecting with their country as well. Final two slides, Ian. And really important that we developed a visitor pledge, wanting everyone to enjoy and discover Scotland, visitors, businesses and communities alike, and showing that in terms of planning ahead, enjoying the best of Scotland, and protecting others, and that message of safe. And then finally, final slide, Ian. The whole approach, initially telling people of Scotland that their country needs them in scale, then moving on to the wider domestic market, an important market, England and the rest of Scotland, and then eventually the international market in our full recovery phase. So again, happy to answer questions on that. It's a quick run through, and I'm sure there will be more questions to answer as we go through. Thank you, Ian.
Screen's frozen again.
Ian, it's Tech here. If you need some additional help, I've got the PowerPoint slide ready to go from my end.
Okay, next slide, please.
Okay, I'll have to bring that up and stop your sharing. 1 second.
Riddell, thank you very much for that wonderful insight and presentation. And Scotland seems to be right in the centre of COVID-19. And there's many issues that you've brought up there which we can discuss at the end of the presentations. Can I please remind participants, if you've got any questions to ask, please use the Q&A button. And as we wait, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Donna Keren, who's the Executive Vice President of New York City and Company. And basically, when you think of New York and you think of COVID-19, we think of New York as being right at the center, being the epicenter in the United States. And we've all seen the stories flashed across the world about the earlier on cases. So, Donna, welcome to New Zealand, and we'll just get your presentation up in a minute, and we can
Sure.
go from there. Apologies for some of the technology issues.
Oh, very used to it. So thank you. First, Ian, thank you, the staff at Victoria University. In the background, and not always in the background, thank you for your behind the scenes efforts. It is a real pleasure for me to share this event with Riddell and with Stefan. And I was breathing deeply as you were talking because I was listening to such smart destination marketers at the national level. And I just want to start, next slide, by introducing what NYC Company is. We're the official destination marketing organization for the city of New York. We are a private membership organization, which will distinguish us in some of the ways that things you hear are very similar to what you've just heard from my colleagues, but will also be different. One of the things, I'm a native New Yorker, that I like to remind people is that New York is an island off the coast of America. And so we have somewhat unique position. There are many more cases outside of New York City and New York State at the moment than there are or have been in New York. So we're shifting the balance a little bit. But that private sector positioning becomes very important to what we're doing. Next slide. We are facing the COVID-19 situation by doing it collectively. What you're looking at here is the beginning of a manifesto for how we were going to reach out to our industry, our city, the business community, to create a coalition to work together to bring about the recovery. This was designed for the hospitality and tourism industry, and like you heard, it was somewhat of a shift from looking at visitors, whether domestic or international, to focusing on our local population. Next. coalition website looks like this. It came together in early April as we began to reach out to the community for private sector engagement and support. It's chaired by a diverse array of leaders from the hospitality and leisure sector, including restaurants, museums, hotels, and the arts. For those of you who know New York, it is also a 5-borough representation that is all of the parts of New York City. I encourage you to check out our website because you can see this publicly, coalition.nycgo.com. And as I think I mentioned, literally the coalition just finished a meeting 3 minutes ago discussing the program that I'm going to be sharing with you right now. Next slide. So we had to approach this, and this will look very familiar to what you've just heard, a coalition set of goals that would be phased in, but work that would grow out of both the experience of the tourism experts and leadership, as well as the current need. First and foremost was an absolute commitment to public health and safety that leads everything we are doing. Second was to drive it by creativity and innovation, the thing that we believe is part of the DNA of New York City. And third, to do it in partnership with leaders across industries to meet a need that was greater than any DMO or tourism organization could do on its own. Next. So what's at stake? I don't usually need to tell researchers and tourism people about these statistics. This is something we put in the coalition report for government, but we're talking about 67 million visitors last year, 10 years of record performance, a $72 billion industry, 400,000+ jobs. And similar to what you were both mentioning, 20% of New York visitation is international, but our international visitors spend about 50% of the money that gets spent. And that has completely come to a stop. So as we go forward from this 5-month drop down to virtually nothing, how do we move forward? I keep reaching for adjectives that can encompass the scope of what's going on. My latest is unthinkable, but in fact, it's pretty much all any of us are thinking about. So maybe I said unanswerable, because the answers many of us have found don't seem to solve to the problems, economic or social. And as the resurgence of disease across the US and other destinations suggests, we haven't found the entire solution yet. But we're marketers and we're researchers, and we can't accept that there are no answers. So that too is unthinkable, but we're going to try and deal with this as best we can. So next slide. The best we can is a plan in 3 stages. That is rise, renew, recover. It's a slightly abbreviated version of what we just saw for Scotland. This comes directly from the coalition blueprint, which we released this afternoon. And these are active verbs. These are phases of reimagining, reactivating, rebuilding the industry to support the city, and with that, neighborhoods and jobs. The image up at the right-hand corner is familiar to all of us. It's a logical approach from your locals to your drive market, to your domestic and beyond. But it also actually matches the profile of those 66 million visitors that I talked about. 1/4 of the US population lives within a 1-day's drive of New York. And they are our largest domestic market. And that is probably close to 30 million people a year. So that is, aside from our immediate local, that is our next target. Next slide. So we're past stage 1 and rise, which was primarily to assure and educate both the businesses locally and our consumers. This is 17 weeks at this point. And it has been two things: the focus on essential safety protocols and regulations, and a way to keep the businesses in New York City thriving to the extent that we can. Next slide. So we had a number of tactics. I'm going to go through them quickly. One was aimed at our membership. It's 2,000 businesses and enterprises and organizations who needed to hear from us as the leadership, or who we could bring in to educate them on safety and other issues. Next. We also had to talk to consumers. And here we coordinated and promoted efforts to identify what was physically open in the city, restaurants and stores that you could take out, pick up, or go to for delivery, or what, in the case of cultural organizations and tourist attractions, we're making virtual experiences available. There are more than 250 of them at this point, and these are extremely popular parts of our website and activity drivers. Next. There's a B2B educational content going back to our relationships with the travel trade, and on the right-hand side, something that has really begun to take off for the meeting planners, virtual site tours. We're getting very, very positive reaction to that. Next slide. So stage 2 was all about inspiration and encouragement, and to a very large extent, repositioning NYC & Company, because as both of my colleagues have mentioned, talking to your locals was not our primary job. Our primary job was bringing in other people. So we've rethought and restructured some of what we're doing. We're in phase 3 in New York, which is not quite as open as we had hoped. No indoor dining at the moment. And we have added 22 states to the list of people who, if they come to New York from those United States destinations, mostly in the South and the West, will need to self-quarantine for 14 days. These are the places in the US now with uncontrolled increases in infection. New York led the way through this process. We not only leveled the curve, we have pretty much brought it down to very, very low levels. And we are working as a state and a city to protect that. Next slide. I mentioned before the notion of health and safety. We created a Stay Well NYC pledge. It launched on June 23rd, and it is both a business pledge to protect their employees and their customers, and a guest pledge to behave responsibly, wearing masks, and following the best safety protocols. We have a hashtag that has just launched called Mask On NYC. We think it's very important to show just how acceptable mask wearing is. It's become a fashion accessory. I just bought my most fashionable mask the other day. Next. So I mentioned that we're reaching out. There's a lot of user-generated and visual content. Ian told me no videos, so you're just going to have to imagine how beautiful these are, or check out our website, nycco.com, to see what we've been able to do. Next slide. I think one of the most exciting tactics that is launching last week and will run for the next couple of months is a public art fund partnership we're calling Art on the Grid. It's 50 New York artists, 50 new works being phased in 10 works at a time across the city's out-of-home advertising spaces. So it's dispersed around the city, it's easy to get to, it's free, and we're working on ways of connecting those sites to the businesses in the area to encourage shopping, dining, other activities, and we're beginning to track that with some big data opportunities. Next slide. So this was the big news that hit my organization and the press this morning. All in NYC is the recovery branding campaign. My creative director likes to say it's deceptively simple. We're all in New York City because we can't get out or because we don't want to go anywhere else. We're all in as we've thrown in everything we've got to make this city survive. And of course, everything you want or need is all in New York City. This is going to be an online campaign. It will be an out-of-home campaign. It will be social. It will be digital. And it is a rallying cry and a platform for taking us into the future. And because I have New Zealanders on the call, let me just say that if you are a surfer, there is astonishing surfing off the coast of New York in the Atlantic Ocean, and you can take your surfboard on the subway. So when we open, you're welcome to come back. Next slide. This is stage 3, and we're not here yet. We believe we will be, but we are not. So all I can say now is watch for it. And as my colleague Adam Sachs from Tourism Economics says, recovery is inevitable. Next slide. And because I head up the research unit, I just want to point out that the roadmap for recovery, which we just released, includes 4 whole pages on research. Well, 3 if you discount the 7, the lucky 7, which is the chapter heading, on how we're going to measure the effects of the COVID crisis and our recovery. Next slide. Happy to share this with folks because it's way too small to read, but this is in the plan on how we are going to measure each phase of the recovery and what we're looking to do. I'm open to suggestions, ideas, connections, anything else. So next slide, thank you. Unmute. Ian, you're muted.
Thank you to all of our 3 speakers, Riddell, Stephen and Donna. 3 wonderful insights into how 3 different destinations at different stages within COVID-19 have responded. And I think upon reflection, the devastation of this disease, of this pandemic has been huge across the world. And here in New Zealand, personally, I just feel very lucky in the terms of how we've managed it and how we've isolated from the rest of the world. But the attitudes of people towards each other has been absolutely wonderful. And I see very much similar messages in Scotland and in New York. So before we go any further, just some questions to the panel. Riddell, Stephen and Donna, listening to the other 2 speakers that you've had, is there anything that resonates with you? So first of all, to Stephen.
Yeah, thank you. I guess one is the obvious similarities between the different destinations, you know, in terms of the phases of thinking. We all have slightly different words for them, but the kind of the gist of it being, you know, how do you respond immediately? How do you work together and collaborate with others to restart the economy and tourism and make sure people feel safe and secure in doing so? And then how do you use the crisis to, I guess, reimagine, if you like, for lack of a better term, how the tourism industry would shape itself in the future? And I think that sort of comes through pretty clearly to me, is that it's very similar. A couple of other things that do spring to mind. One is, and I think you touched on this too, Ian, you know, New Zealand's, part because of its geography and partly because of its I guess, action, you know, the nature of the actions taken by government very early on, does seem to be a little bit further ahead in terms of dealing with the immediate crisis. Certainly, that's how it occurs to me. It's sort of that we have a lot more freedom of movement. You know, we don't have COVID in the community at the current time in New Zealand, so people are able to freely move about. And I think that has a very, very big impact on the rate of recovery of the tourism industry at a local, regional, and national level. Just that ability to move around. I think we just have to. I guess I'm reflecting, listening to Donna and also Riddell about how quickly we could take that for granted, you know, how that's an incredibly important, I guess, milestone to have achieved, and therefore how do we make sure that we gain on that and build on that particular status, and therefore not be complacent about it, because I think it's very important. Like, I think it's a very important thing. That would probably be my first observations, and then I guess the other one is just this local, you know, the local, the regional, the national, the international. That phasing, I think, is really important. I saw a question which I replied to in writing that came through asking about whether I feel that the post-COVID world would see more recognition of the need for the sector to deliver value to the local community and the domestic market, whether it's a permanent shift. And I think it is. I mean, I actually think people will be less complacent about the importance of the local and domestic consumer and visitor to places than perhaps they have been for a little while. I think that's going to become a very key component of the future tourism economy. Even though it's always been there, I don't think it's necessarily been directly addressed at a destination management level or destination marketing level. It's always been others coming in, if you like. That seems to be the focus. So I think that's one of the takeaways from the discussion this morning.
Okay. Riddell?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think really interesting listening to Stephen about encouraging New Zealanders to not just rediscover, but discover their own country. I mean, I think we've always had a tradition in Scotland that people have holidayed in Scotland, but over the past number of years, more and more have travelled abroad to the sun destinations. Our summer weather is not particularly reliable. However, this year, I think, given the lockdown, more and more people, more and more Scots will holiday in Scotland for the first time for a number of years. And I think that's really good, because they will discover something that they've not been aware of for some time. Like Stephen, I was struck by the similarities, particularly with New York, and almost the different words, but the same approach. And we're in a very similar situation. We're still pretty much in lockdown. Only last Friday were we allowed to travel any more than 5 miles from home. So it wouldn't have mattered if the whole of the tourism industry opened up. We wouldn't have been able to get there. Now, that's changed. As of last Friday, we can travel anywhere in Scotland, and self-catering opened for the first time last week. And there's been a huge spike in demand for that, purely because there's a pent-up demand, and people suddenly recognize this is a great opportunity to help the industry recover. And we're hoping that we'll get more announcements tomorrow from our First Minister. One of the big challenges we've got, which maybe people don't quite understand, is that although we're part of the United Kingdom, we have our own government, and tourism is devolved, and a lot of other functions are devolved. And so I live almost on the border between Scotland and England, and the policies in England are different to Scotland. So tourism's opened up more quickly in England than it has in Scotland, which is a bit frustrating for folk that live just on the other side of the river here. So I think that's a bit of a challenge between the two governments in terms of policy and decision making. But yeah, a lot of similarities that I had in all three presentations.
Donna? Thank you, Riddell. Donna?
I want to echo some of that and reposition it in our case. The 50 US states don't see eye to eye and don't follow the same rules and don't have a national government taking a leadership role. I'm envious. I have a very strong governor who has positioned himself as one of the sages and leaders of this. The city's tourism industry takes this very seriously. But there was never a time here where you weren't allowed to travel. Your travel was limited by other localized rules, whether you had to self-quarantine. And obviously a state like Hawaii, which can only be reached by air or water, has been able to do that in a way that the rest of us who are connected to the mainland in one way or another have not been able to do. But I think what I heard from all of us was you pull from your experience, because you're assuming certain things about human nature, human psychology, the human desire to travel and be social. And you know that it's been disrupted by not traveling more than 5 miles, or not having the ability to leave the country, no less have someone come in. And that pent-up demand, that dreaming about travel, that tapping into people's expectations, aspirations, plans, not for the next 6 weeks or 6 months, but travelers want to travel. And as long as you understand that and what they're looking for, and I heard that from the other presentations, to quote Adam Sachs again, recovery is inevitable. I really don't think that all of us want to sit in our kitchens, apartments, and home offices for the rest of our lives in isolation.
Okay. I'm just wondering if Riddell, Stephen, and Donna would like to share just one moment or one story of success, or what am I trying to ask the question? The question I'm trying to ask, what has been the opportunity or silver lining of COVID-19 to you? Has something emerged that's been a good story?
Can I start on that? Yeah. I think it was leadership. I think it repositioned my organization in the eyes of a lot of local people, local businesses, especially elected officials, and brought together a coalition of leaders who might not necessarily have been engaged with each other. That was across the diversity of business levels, sizes. The US is dealing with a very, very deep and old set of issues about inclusion and diversity. And we are taking a leadership position as an industry in directly addressing that. So when you're bringing in record numbers of visitors every year for 10 years in a row, people expect it and they don't pay attention. And when that stops, as it has, virtually down to nothing, all of a sudden they are looking to you for answers and for leadership and for a way to help us move forward. So it's a big burden, but I think that is the silver lining for us as an organization and for the industry as a whole.
If I could answer from a Scottish perspective, I think the really important thing that's come through from the way that we've been dealing with it and the way that the whole thing has worked out is the importance of involving the community in decision making, and therefore as a result that piece around a future that is much more focused on responsible tourism rather than large numbers, low value. I think the future will be about quality, and that's come through really strongly. Community concern about bringing the virus in has made people realize that communities need to have a role in the policy making and the decision making. Tourism businesses are part of that community, but equally that getting that balance right is something that's come through very strongly. And I'm just hoping that that continues in the future and we don't revert back to what we were before. So I think from is it a silver lining? Yeah, I think that greater interaction with communities is something that has come through really strongly indeed.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think both the comments from Donna and Riddell I think are bang on. There's been a significant opportunity for leadership, particularly around the tourism sector and the visitor economy. And I think the role of community and coordination at a local levels, I think been a real highlight so far, the ability to engage in a different way and have a different conversation about the sector. From a Tourism New Zealand perspective, I think having the opportunity to pick up the mantle and domestic part of the tourism economy and bringing the domestic and international together, and therefore being able to create a much more holistic view of the shape and impact of the system and the sector is going to be something that I think will stand us in very good stead going forward, and it will give us a different, I guess, set of levers to work with as an organisation to have a more meaningful and positive impact at a community, social, environmental, and of course economic level. So I think it's a real silver lining. I think the other one which builds on that is we've had to reconnect and rebuild a number of relationships as a business within government, but also very importantly with regional New Zealand in a way that we haven't had to do for a while. And I think that's going to again be something that's been a real bonus. It's been a real eye opener for the organisation, and you know, I think it's going to be something that we will build on and increasingly and you know, have impacts on our insights, our understanding of participation, how we make the industry more inclusive, how we drive better understanding amongst New Zealanders of the importance of tourism to their lifestyle, their community, the richness and fabric of the places they live, work and play as well. And I think those connections and that fabric that's been built as a result of COVID-19 is actually a real benefit.
Okay. So just a couple of questions. Thank you, Stephen. Just a couple of questions taken from the Q&A sessions. To everybody, from a marketing perspective or an engagement perspective, how is the message different now in the terms of you as DMOs engaging with the domestic market? How is the message different?
Are you asking in from a perspective of the marketing, the content, the core?
Yeah, a couple of questions have come through. I think what Riddell picked up and yourself picked up, that there hasn't been a desire previously for people to holiday in their own destination. You know, the aspiration was to go abroad, the desire was to go abroad. So the message, but that message is now different. You have a different audience who have different values. So how do you reimagine tourism to those audiences? And how is the engagement differently because you're not doing it to an international market, it's more of a domestic market?
I'm happy to have a crack at that to start with. It's quite a complex question.
unless Riddell or Donna would like to answer that one, or while Stephen thinks about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of touched on it in the marketing part of my presentation. It's very much about obviously the three stages are Scots holidaying in Scotland, the domestic market, UK to Scotland, and then international. So the message has been very much around highlighting the huge opportunities, the hidden gems, the things that people may have forgotten about in their own country that are on their own doorstep, and the opportunities to revisit some of the memories that they've had from a long time ago. So I think the messaging will be around all of those things, the iconic images that we've got, the reminding Scots of what they are, and also keeping Scotland front of mind, and making people feel proud of their own country. I think that's a very strong element that's coming through in the messaging that we're going to put out, but very strong image-based and touching the heartstrings, I suppose, of Scots.
Donna or Stephen? Sorry, just need to unmute Donna.
Sorry, we've had some experience in the past with what we, not a term I like, but we call the staycation. That you don't need to travel very far to come to a city like New York, which pretty much has everything in it. As I said, surfing and the ocean. But that rebuilding that pride is a part of it. Certainly there are lots of stories about people giving up on cities, and watch out New Zealand and Scotland, because you may be getting some of them who think they can work from home and live and be out of doors. So our messaging has always had this double-sided sense of all are welcome and you'll find yourself here. Whether that's for a long weekend or a 2-week vacation, or just you chose New York. And most of the people, that 8.5 million people who live here, are not from here. I'm one of the native borns, and we are a minority. So we tell that story to ourselves and to each other and to our domestic and our international markets. People like to come and watch us. The complexity and speed and diversity of New York life is, like any of the world's great cities, one of those things that travelers come to take a look at. And we're just doing a job of reminding people who live locally that it's there for them. I think Paris has a great model of this. It's basically Paris for Parisians, and you can have the museum with no tourists. So go check it out, because they're not there to get in your way. And so those things that you couldn't go see, you can go and experience right now.
Stephen, thank you. Thank you, Donna.
Yeah, thank you, Donna and Riddell. That was very interesting. I think from our point of view, domestically, it's the core campaign message platform we're using is called Do Something New New Zealand, and that's built on this insight that people need to do something that they haven't done before, which answers a few of the questions in here about, what is the positioning taken for granted, and do people really need to get out and experience and understand New Zealand? And I think it's 100% driven by that insight that New Zealanders need to go and do something new and break habits, because we're quite habitual holidaymakers in our own back garden. We go to the Batch and we'll throw the holiday house for the non-Kiwis on the call, and you buy things from the grocery store, and that's kind of a routine where you stay at friends and family. And what we really want to do is get people to break the routine and do something new, because in doing something new, they'll experience parts of New Zealand they haven't experienced before. They'll go to places, meet people, try activities and things. That's the core of our domestic campaign messaging. And it's going to be several years worth of work, and there'll be phases and waves to that activity so that we target and tick off different parts of New Zealand's economy as we do so. Internationally, a couple of years ago, we shifted 100% Pure New Zealand's positioning from being about being really only about our place, and we added our people in there. And some of you would be familiar with our Good Morning World campaign, which finished in June, which was about bringing some of the human aspects of New Zealand to life in our international marketing. And we actually had planned to continue to evolve that narrative to bring in more of our values-based views of the world into sort of a place, people, and purpose kind of narrative. And we're going to continue to evolve that. And internationally right now, as I mentioned at the beginning, keeping our brand alive is very, very important. And so there's been less emphasis on the visitation piece and more emphasis on who we are and what we believe is important. Because obviously you can still consume our wine and drink our beer and buy our fiber and use our technology and digitally experience different things. And you can still plan for a visit here sometime in the future. You just can't physically come yet. And so we've had to find a way of shifting that messaging to keep New Zealand's, I guess, values front and center of our core audiences internationally while they can't come. So that's probably the two big things.
Okay, thank you very much. It's now 9:30, so I'm going to bring this webinar to a close. So first of all, I'd like to thank Riddell, Stephen, and Donna for some excellent insights, but also the common messages that we have between us. And I think there's a realization amongst political leaders and the audiences of our destinations how important tourism is, what it does for its community, what it does for our culture, and what it does economically. And I think it's very important, and how the three countries and destinations, Scotland, New Zealand and New York, have responded to this crisis, and there's lots we can learn. So thank you very much, and it's really appreciated. Whether it's 10:30 in the evening or 1 o'clock in the afternoon or breakfast here in New Zealand, I really appreciate the contribution that you made and your comments. Just for the audience, this video has been recorded and it will be placed onto YouTube. Those that have registered for the seminar will receive a copy to that link, so people can rewatch this webinar at their own time. And it's just to remind people that the next two, we've got 2 more webinars planned at Victoria University, one on the 9th of, one on the 22nd of July on revenue management and value pricing, and then one on the 14th of August on responsible tourism in New Zealand and what the future could look like. And again, they'll be on our university website. So thank you very much. And as Jacinda often says to us, please be kind. And I look forward to revisiting New York and Scotland. And I've already booked my holiday in the Coromandel this year. So I'm going to be doing what Stephen's been asking us to do in practice. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.